It's back. He has two back. He's done it. Sharma has done it. And the end, delirious.
Hello and welcome to The Last Wicket, a cricket podcast that makes perfect listening for when your favorite team finishes a test match with 2 to 3 days to spare. I'm your host Benny, and I'm usually joined by a few friends for this segment, Mayank, Nish, and Himanish, but we have no time to waste, so we're getting right to it. This week we are joined by journalist Karunya Keshav, who also co-authored the book The Fire Burns Blue, A History of Women's Cricket in India, and former cricketer and current managing editor of Women's Crick Zone, Ananya Upendran. Together, they talk the beginnings of women's cricket in India and their evolution over the years, continuing challenges within the system, rising stars to watch out for, the projects they're currently involved in, and so much more. Here's a conversation they had with the Last Wicket co-hosts, Mayank and Himanish.
So far on The Last Wicket, in our episodes, we've covered various aspects of men's cricket, be it England's ability to play spin or Faf du Plessis' retirement. Now, with the arrival of the South African women in India, we're really excited to bring on two guests who can really tell us a lot about women's cricket, educate us. Firstly, Karunya Keshav, who is a cricket writer and digital sports content consultant in Bangalore. She wrote the wonderful book, The Fire Burns Blue, comprehensive history on women's cricket, and she's covered cricket for Wisden India Almanac, as well as the ICC. And her new project, which is Equal Way, is she's part of the team which aims to put together a policy framework to support Indian women's cricket over the next decade. So welcome, Karunya. And our next guest is Ananya Upendran. She's a fast bowling all-rounder who's played a long career with Hyderabad, spanning more than over a decade before moving over to Sikkim. She's also had a chance to represent India A and the South Zone. And as a freelance journalist, she's covered various years as a freelance journalist and also worked for Wisden India covering the 2016 T20 World Cup. Currently, she's the managing editor of Women's Crick Zone since 2019. Thank you for joining the show, Ananya.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's jump into it. So I'll start with you, Karunya. Firstly, we want to talk about The Fire Burns Blue. Really fantastic book. I just finished reading it last week, and I felt like I learned a lot about women's cricket. So tell us a little bit about what your aim was around the book, and obviously you mentioned that primary sources and records were sort of hard to come by. So tell us a little bit about the significant challenges that you came across when you were writing the book.
Thanks for having me. So, The Fire Burns Blue is a book about the history of Indian women's cricket, which I co-wrote with the late Siddhartha Patnaik. It starts from the 70s, from how a bunch of young girls just came together to play cricket, and goes all the way to a little after the 2017 World Cup, when India narrowly lost to England in the final at Lord's, with the world watching. So it's about all these generations of women with this really strong thread of ambition that connects them, and the sense of fun and freedom that they have while playing cricket, while overcoming a whole bunch of challenges. It wasn't a very easy book to write about. So the aim of the book was to sort of start a lot of conversations and to acknowledge some people in cricket that haven't been spoken about before. Siddhartha and I had met all these women and we'd been inspired by them, and there was just not enough data, information, stats around them. So if we wanted to write a story about something that happened in 89, we just didn't have that information. And we also realized that a lot of the women themselves, this is a lot of oral history which changes, which people forget. So we thought it was really important to have some written document about the history of women's cricket. As I said, it wasn't easy to get a lot of these stats. There were little bits in newspapers, in archives, but probably really not enough. One of the big sources that we found was Anandji Dosa. He'd given his journals to the library at the CCI at Brabon Stadium. So he is, I think, someone the statisticians in India really look up to. And I think we found a lot of really interesting things in his notes as well, including things like, what was given out as a player of the match award to someone, like I think one, he spoke about chocolates that were given out, or like a Luna, or I think somewhere there was a sewing machine. So, these little interesting bits like that. It was good to have something. It was not comprehensive, but it was a start.
That makes sense, and that's really interesting. That tidbit reminds me. Recently, I saw somebody getting 5 liters of petrol in a match or someplace. So that's what that reminds me. That but it's interesting where all these events that have happened, and just because of sort of lack of documentation, it becomes sometimes a little bit of a game of Chinese whispers, where you're just relying on sources who've been around, and so it's definitely good to see that Anandji Dosa's records have been, as you mentioned, he's been a bit of a legend as far as cricket statistics are concerned.
Yeah, so I think this book is fantastic because it attempts to create that first comprehensive record of women's cricket. And I've been reading through it, and it's really good. And I can imagine the kind of challenges you would have gone through. I want to start at the beginning and ask you, Karunya. Now, the patronage of men's and women's cricket was very different. Like, the stories were very different. Men's cricket was patronized by the princes, by the British. Women's cricket was patronized by the rich Indians. So can you talk more about that and what it means for the two games today?
Yeah, this is something we did wonder about. The way men's cricket came together in India and the way women's cricket came up is very different. So even the whole, the pentangular that you had in Bombay, how cricket was even segregated, that sort of never happened in the women's game. There's
Right.
almost as if there is no record of women's cricket happening before the 70s. There are these little bits and pieces around the country, some teacher in Kerala that wanted to play, some British officer's wife who sort of helped local people pick up the game. But it seemed almost like a sideshow, something for amusement, entertainment. So where we had a lot of women taking up tennis, and where football was almost seen as an anti-colonial sport in India,
Yeah.
all that, it just seemed to have passed women's cricket. At least we may find some document at some point which sort of challenges these views, but based on what we have, this is, I suppose, a fair assessment. One big reason why it was, I wouldn't say elites, but definitely people of a certain milieu in society that played women's cricket, it was because they had to pay their own way.
Right, makes sense.
It's not that men's cricket was financially lucrative then either, but it was definitely more than this. And more than anything else, it was very young women. So it had a lot of their parents supporting them. And a lot of their parents themselves were people who were involved in cricket, maybe who didn't get to see their dreams be realized at the state level or a national level. But these are, grandmothers and mothers who watched a lot of cricket and were like, it's okay to play. It's okay if my girl plays. And that's not a sentiment that comes from many Indian families still.
Right.
So it is a very particular set of women that played. And actually, even if you see now, I wouldn't say it's been played by the elite in Indian society, because sport is livelihood for a lot of people. So maybe it has sort of changed now, but it still requires a certain amount of financial self-sufficiency to play cricket, because it's an expensive.
So my next question, I was reading about 1973 when club cricket was sort of the only, women's cricket around, and there were teams which traveled 3 days and, to play maybe one game or play for a few hours. And the facilities were poor. Obviously, at that point, there were also safety challenges. And it almost reminded me of the women's IPL last year, or the T20 Challenge. Ananya, I'll get your thoughts first as to, have things really changed? Because I feel like even though all of this progress has happened, many of these cricketers are, household names to some extent. The fact is they quarantined for so long in last year's women's IPL, and then they ended up playing 3 games. So that has to be a little frustrating. And how do you sort of see the parallels since the 70s?
Well, I think it'd be a little harsh to say things haven't changed. I mean, things have definitely changed, but When I was watching that, or I mean, looking at that women's T20 challenge, something that I was reminded of was actually inter-university tournaments that happen now. So like it reminded me of something that I went through where we traveled for 3 days to get from Hyderabad to Delhi. Our draws were, we were directly in the quarterfinals. So we spent like 7 days in Jaunpur, which in February, I think. So it was really, really cold. It was like 4 degrees. So we spent a week there with absolutely no cricket. We played one game, got knocked out in the first game, and then came back home in a general compartment. So that was pretty much what I thought of when I saw that women's T20 challenge, and what happened with velocity. So uh, look, I think things have changed. We also do need to remember that these are kind of extraordinary instances where yes, they weren't handled very well, but this is hopefully just a one-off thing where we don't continue to see this kind of treatment for the women's game. But in terms of, I think the way things are structured, at least in domestic cricket, it's slightly better. I think that while we don't play as much as say they used to do in the early 2000s, at least within the domestic circuit, there is a better structure in terms of when you're going to play, whom you're going to play against. So all that's kind of drawn up slightly well in advance. Not this time, of course, again, extraordinary circumstances, but
Sure.
I think from say 2008, things have been better structured. We have been playing a lot more games. Again, maybe not at age group level, but I think senior level, there have been a decent number of games. So yeah, I think things have changed, not as fast as I think a lot of us would have liked, but they are on the upward climb.
Sure. Karanya, would you like to add anything there?
No, I agree. I think the biggest change has been in terms of facilities. I don't think it can be compared at all. The kind of access to world-class infrastructure that a lot of the top athletes have, and even at the state level, they do have access to these international grounds a lot of the time. And that is the biggest change. The budgets are massively different now. And those are all wins that do need to be considered.
Absolutely. That makes sense. That's pretty fair. Yeah, you're right. They were, sort of shocking circumstances or, circumstances which are sort of out of their control. But I personally was a little disappointed just to see, 3 games after all these players, over 40, 50 players quarantining for such a long time.
So I want to tie into that. Karunya, the BCCI took over women's cricket in 2006. So has that led to an expansion in the facilities and an improvement in the infrastructure for the women's game? Because this also led to the loss of the Railways team and the Air India team, which were two of the big giants in the system. How is the BCCI coming in sort of changed women's cricket? Has it been positive, a net positive?
I would say so. I think it has been a massive positive, simply because how things were before, they were always struggling for financial survival, and that is no way to do it. We have stories of Shubhangi Kulkarni, who was running things before she actually helped merge things with the BCCI, saying that she had to break her FDs just to make sure that a lot of these girls get to play or get to prepare for a World Cup. And that is no way to run things.
Wow.
The fact that the Air India Railways competition was broken, that of course is a loss. But if you think about it, if things are done in a right way, it still means that the BCCI runs a lot of really successful competitive tournaments, such as the IPL. So there are other things in which women's cricket in India can build that rivalry onto, can build that sense of competition onto. At a previous time, there was also a lot of competition for between the two associations for grounds, for access to grounds. There were clashes, because the men's game was playing, because the men were playing at a certain ground at a certain time. The women often had to move their match because it would clash with the TV slots if they were lucky enough to be shown on TV. So things like that. There are also contracts now. Maybe the biggest drawback is that before there used to be a lot of women in charge, and that isn't the case anymore. If there is no one person or one wing in the BCCI that is prioritizing women's cricket, if they get that right, I think a lot of the problems will be solved.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, like Karuna said, a lot has changed, a lot of positive change. There is, or players do get access to better grounds, better facilities. You're able to practice on turf wickets, which wasn't previously possible, at least for state players. So, that kind of access is definitely improved. But as far as the Air India Railways thing is concerned, it's one of my biggest irritations actually, is that if you look at the domestic circuit and the players within the domestic circuit, if you're able to find anyone over 25 who is not employed in railways and who is not essentially contracted, I mean, I'll doff my hat to you, because there are very, very few girls who are committed enough or are able to stay in the system, because it's not there's no motivation to stay in the system once you
Right.
cross 25, because let's be
Right.
honest, we're slightly an ageist system. So, your chances of playing a higher level kind of reduce. You don't have an employer who will, give you time off to play if you're not employed with the railways. So there are a lot of issues there. And I think that's one of my major irritations with the system, is that we lose a lot of players who are kind of just reaching their prime. And if you think about like countries like Australia, I think the strength of any system or any domestic system is the senior players. And even if you look at men's cricket, it is the Wasim Jafars, the Amol Mazumdars, the Ambati Raidus right now, who kind of provide, I suppose, a stability to allow the likes of Rishabh Pant and Ishan Kishan to flourish. And within a domestic system, if you aren't able to motivate those players to stay there, it kind of weakens the system itself. And I think that's why a lot of people are advocating for an IPL, because at least then you're kind of motivating these girls to stick in the system, and it allows then players like Shafali Verma, like Jamima Rodriguez, to learn quickly and then adapt quicker at international level. So I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks of, or if you can call it a drawback of the BCCI having taken over. But again, when you look at men's cricket, there are so many corporate tournaments. So those are things that I think need to be started in the women's circuit.
Very fascinating.
That
So
makes
it's
sense.
like you don't have experienced players who stay in the system to give back, right? So the system is weakened because of that. Very fascinating.
So switching over slightly, so we've talked about sort of the structure that BCCI has, especially as respect to facilities and what it gives to the senior players. But talking about more at the grassroots level, has that changed a lot? Are there a lot more academies out there which girls or women in smaller town can go to, or is it fairly restricted to the bigger cities?
Yeah, I think right now it's largely restricted to the bigger cities. I think while a lot of players are emerging from smaller towns, I think practice facilities or high quality practice facilities are still centered in the larger cities, and that's one of the major issues, I think, in terms of at least branching out and finding more players more quicker. So yeah, that's one of the issues. And I think in terms of at the grassroots, if you're looking at things like school cricket, that's pretty non-existent. I mean, you're probably able to find it in Bombay, or Hyderabad has an inter-school competition, but it's very few and far between. It's also only associations that are willing to take that step and are actually willing to do it themselves. It's only there that you'll find inter-school cricket. Again, I'm going to talk about something that happened when I was in school, when I was in 12th or something. I went and spoke to the principal about starting a girls' team in my school. And so I made announcements across middle school, high school, primary school, and there were a lot of girls, surprisingly, who wanted to play cricket. And so I went to Hyderabad Public School. It's a very, I suppose it's a school with a cricketing background, since Mohammad Azharuddin went there. And so there were facilities, there were coaches. So I went to the principal with this list of around 50 or 60 girls who were interested in playing. And he said, sure, you can get them to practice, but one, you cannot practice when the boys are practicing. And two, you will have to hire your own coach. So I mean, of course, it didn't work out and we weren't able to do it. We played a few games ourselves during the breaks and things like that. But I just think that those type of things, state associations, of course, have to kind of encourage schools to start women's teams, because that's where, girls kind of pick up games quickly. I think, when you look at people like Shikha Pandey, who probably I think she started training professionally at 18. She started training professionally at 18 and is very, very successful. Imagine if you get a girl who's able to play a large number of sports. Think of someone like Sophie Devine, and then kind of transfer all those skills into cricket as a professional slightly later. I think there's so much that we can do, but we're only catching these girls slightly later. And again, there's no motivation to stay in the game once you start understanding it. So that I think there are lots of issues that kind of
Yeah.
snowball, and yeah, but I think age group cricket is a lot better. It's just there's just not as much of it as there should.
And Karanya, before I throw that question to you, also want to talk about BCCI's Vision 2020 and how much success do you see with that?
I don't know if the Vision 2020 was ever really made public, or if anyone actually set achievable goals and achievable targets for it. And if anything, from a grassroots program to an elite high performance program has to succeed, you do need these achievable targets that saying, okay, in 5 years, this is what we want to try and achieve. It doesn't have to be we want to win a World Cup, or even if it is that, you need to work backwards and say maybe we want to have so many girls playing cricket at this age at this age group. As of now, we don't even have that data. We don't know how many girls are playing cricket in India. We don't know at what point they're leaving the sport. Anecdotally, we know that the minute there's a change from tennis ball cricket to leather ball or harder ball cricket, the minute they need to sort of invest more into their kit, some people drop off. The minute you need to start traveling for matches, some people drop off. Then further on, 10th, 12th, as Ananya said, after 25, when jobs are less, potentially marriage, all this is anecdotal. We don't know when people drop out of cricket. And before developing any vision, any program at any level, you do need to sort of have a better idea than we do right now about this system itself.
So for the next question, Karuna, I'll go to you first. Talking about World Cups in specific, we've talked a little bit about grassroots. So switching back to World Cups and what people see. Obviously, in 1988, India's entry was not sent due to some miscommunication. There are other World Cups where the Indian team turned up with 18 months of no international cricket or no match practice. And it just boggles my mind. Firstly, I'll say that. And then the ongoing series as well with South Africa. That's another example where they're playing 1 day after 400 odd days. And compare that to the three big nations in women's cricket, which is New Zealand, Australia, and England. To some extent, South Africa as well, and how much match practice they get. It's clear that we're hampering their chances at doing well at a World Cup. We're not giving them enough match practice. But what are the other key things that come to mind which are hampering India's chances as far as the World Cup is concerned?
So for the T20 World Cup last year, India went into it with excellent match practice. Even the T20 World Cup before that, they went into it with excellent match practice. I think for the first time you speak to the girls, they would have actually said, we can't complain about this. So in terms of organizing matches, the BCCI until the pandemic had got a lot better about it. I think this year has shown us how weak that foundation is, how weak that success is. And it is something that they do need to work on. Coming to the World Cup itself, India has featured in a lot of finals without being able to take that, that last step. And after every time there are these postmortems that are done about, one of the big things that comes up is that there is no strong bench. There is no strong bench because you don't have these pathway structures. You don't have this large group of people with which to pick from. As we're speaking, India are playing a series where are playing an international series where it's been said again and again that they hope to experiment and try new faces at this level. But this is something that should happen at a level before the international, before people get to this, before they represent India, they need to have done a lot of work to get there. They need to have been given a lot of confidence before getting there. about the level of cricket awareness. How do they play under pressure situations? Maybe the team needs a mental coach to help them through certain situations. This is something that has come up again and again. So on one side the issue is systemic, where you talk about pathways, and on the other side it is also cricketing, by which you identify those areas in cricket where the team maybe is slightly behind, say somewhere like in Australia or in England. For example, our, our power play scoring, where does it stand compared to other teams? The middle overs, what are the run rates like? So things like this, it also comes down to coaching. And so I think it's a mix of two. It's a mix of systemic change that needs to happen, as well as, like a different kind of understanding on the cricketing side of things.
I completely agree with what Karina said, especially about the systemic issues that we have. But in terms of just the cricketing issues, I think one of the things that where India is kind of really far behind, especially the women's team, is just the use of data. I think we don't use data as well as we could. There is now so much available. Most matches are streamed, so you can watch videos and you can see things like that. But we just don't seem to use the available data to then create strategies or find ways to overcome different types of opposition, and like she said, maybe look into the way we're approaching power plays, whether that's with the ball or with the bat. And so things like that, I think having seen how that system works, especially in women's cricket, I think we're really far behind in terms of how we use data, and teams like Australia and even South Africa now are kind of using that data against us. And for some reason we haven't caught up, because I think we've been exposed, especially in these knockout games, where I think a lot of people have spoken about the need for a sports psychologist or a mental coach, but then there is this other issue, which is cricketing, which is, I don't think we employ the right strategies at the right times. And that's simply because I think we're refusing to move at the same pace as, say, in Australia. Because if you look at the way we play ODI cricket, and I think we're a fantastic ODI side, but we're still kind of playing maybe like 5 years behind in Australia is at the moment. So those are issues that if we really are very serious about playing a World Cup, it reflects in the selections we make, it reflects in the way we approach choosing our 11 for different things. So systemic issues, cricketing issues, and I think I'm hoping that I think 2022 is actually a huge chance for us to actually potentially to win a World Cup, but I think we'll have to really, really quickly fix a lot of it.
Yeah, and to your point about sort of playing cricket, which Australia was playing 5 years ago, that almost reminded me of this series, and how somebody like Shafali Verma has not been picked in the ODI squad. So that really shocked me, because I thought that with the batting lineup that India has, obviously there's Harmanpreet, Smriti Mandhana can play quickly, but still there's still some firepower that could be added, and Shafali Verma would be pretty useful there. So I do see your point around just adaptability being a little bit lacking in some ways.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the cricket now, because as a casual watcher, I feel that batting has evolved more than bowling in women's cricket. I see a lot more power hitting. What sort of shift have you seen in the last 10 years? Because men's cricket has sort of become batting heavy as far as the white ball is concerned. How does it contrast with what's happening in women's cricket? Is there a trend like that you see? Ananya, if you'd like to go first.
I think there definitely is a trend, and there is a shift towards, I think, a quicker scoring. And I think the batters, like you said, are kind of, I suppose, improving at a different rate than the bowlers. And I think that's, strangely enough, largely due to the fact that we play a lot more white ball cricket. And white ball cricket is largely about dot balls rather than taking wickets. And at least in India, and that's the kind of mindset you grow up on, playing only white ball cricket. You're told in team meetings constantly about just stick to one area, bowl dot balls, and the more dot balls you bowl, the more chance your team will win. So I think bowling is kind of, in white ball cricket in India, is largely a defensive approach, whereas with the bat you're forced to attack because runs are a premium of white ball cricket. So strangely enough, I think it's because we don't play long formats that we're not able to kind of, I suppose, improve at improve at the same rate as the batters. And yeah, I think power hitting has definitely kind of improved, I suppose, hugely. If you look at someone like Shafali Verma, only 6'17", and she's able to clear the ground with ease. And I think that's also largely due to the fact that, at least until say 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot more men's cricket on TV. So you're always wanting to emulate what you see. And then now when you see the women, you're seeing people like Alyssa Healy, like Harmanpreet Kaur, like Smriti Mandana, who are, the people who you want to bat. Like Mithali Raj, yes, is a brilliant player, but her style of batting is slightly outdated now. So the younger generation who are watching cricket are now wanting to be like the bigger hitters. So I think that's what I see
Is this also in sync with what's happening around the world in women's cricket in general? Like, is it batting heavy compared to bowling being defensive, or is it an India specific problem that you see?
I think it's well, the reason why the bowling is the way it is, I think, is maybe an India specific problem, because in domestic cricket you still see a lot of Poonam Rauts and Mithali Rajas, but it's only the extraordinary players who bat like a Smriti Mandana. But I think outside that, when you watch the WBBL or when you watch the KSL, there is, I suppose, a little bit of a more attacking mindset, which is why you see, I think, faster bowlers in, say, in England, in Australia, because they're allowed to be aggressive, they're allowed to bowl as fast as they possibly can and concede runs. Whereas in India, if you go for a boundary, you're like, hey, am I going to get another over? And I think it's kind of a maybe an Indian mindset or a subcontinent.
Just a couple of things to add to that. I think in the last few years, there's also been a really strong attempt to make women's games watchable. So when you're focusing so much on T20s, you're also trying to get pitches that make it a spectacle. This doesn't always happen, as we saw in the T20 challenge last year. But in general, there is this desire around the world to make sure that the pitches are batting friendly, and when you're trying to get crowds in, they're given something to watch. The ICC is actively trying to make T20 the vehicle by which they promote women's cricket around the world, and the T20 does come with a certain element of spectacle associated with it. So I think that is one really important thing. In terms of the bowling, what Ananya said is, I think, spot on, and she probably knows better than me with this. Also, the fact that a lot of the women require, a bit more pace on the ball. It does lead to a more defensive bowling. I think you do have more of the slower bowlers to an extent. You end up maybe trying to go to a certain kind of bowler. Again, I think this is a very small reason, and it is just about batting being the game, being the vehicle by which people are entertained, rightly or wrongly. But maybe like a small reason.
Very fascinating. I want to stay on that because we talked about, power hitting being a spectacle. So Sharda Ugra mentions in the forward to your book that before the 83 World Cup, women's cricket had its fair share of spectators and coverage. But after the win, the men sort of gained more prominence, which pushed women's cricket into the shadows. So do you see a similar thing happening today, where the IPL has sort of saturated the content market and there's so much cricket the men play? Is it sort of dwarfing the women's game in terms of viewership, or do you think it's going side by side and helping it?
I think there's more of a tendency now to almost see men's sport and women's sport as two very separate things when it comes to packaging and selling it. This is not a sort of thinking that has arrived at cricket yet, I feel, but pretty much world over. You look at football, the way a football, uh, uh, women's football World Cup is sold and is marketed. It's completely different from what it was even 5 years ago, because there is this understanding that women's sport offers a it opens up a different market. With basketball, with football, with tennis, obviously has had this for a while, but there is this understanding that there are new avenues of audiences and sponsors that you can open up, and cricket also will ultimately, I think, come around to this. So it's not about IPL taking over all cricket. I mean, I suppose it will still be the biggest money source in cricket, But at the same time, I think there is definitely a space for women's sport, women's cricket to exist, not only alongside it, but in addition.
Again, I completely agree with what she says. I think there is a space for women's cricket to exist as a separate entity, and I think people are beginning to see that, beginning to see the game for what it is, rather than, while it's very slow. I think the comparisons have kind of stopped, or people are trying to stop, comparing a Harmanpreet Kaur with a Virender Sehwag, and you're seeing these women for who they are, rather than trying to, I
Right.
suppose, relate it to men's cricket. And it's a slow improvement, but yeah, it is happening. And I think it kind of gives people like me hope that eventually people will, see them as, I suppose, separate entities, and not have to constantly refer to men's cricket to make women's cricket relevant.
Just to add to this, at the same time, there is something like the 100, which is making sure that women's cricket and men's cricket is treated equally on various
Right.
parameters,
Right.
but also putting it together as in just a day at the cricket, I think is what they're calling it.
Right.
So it is about acknowledging the differences in men's and women's and looking at them as separate, but also there is this place for this product where some of those differences maybe melt away, but you're also highlighting those aspects that require the equality.
Right. And I remember, I think in the 2016 T20 World Cup, I think the women's game were before the men's games in India, or was it some other tournament? It was that, right?
It was
Yeah.
that.
So it was packaged together. Like you could go and have a day at the cricket and watch both the games. Yeah. So I also want to talk about upcoming talent, right? Jemima Rodriguez and Shefali Verma are like young and they're very talented. Who else do you think, Ananya, is a name to look out for in the future?
You're putting me on the spot here. But I guess if you look, at the current Indian team, there are, of course, girls like Radha Yadav who've kind of taken to international cricket very quickly. She's had a fair bit of success at the international level. So, I think she's definitely someone who's kind of beginning to entrench herself in that Indian team. And I think going forward, she will be a key member in both formats. And if we ever play Test cricket again, maybe that as well. But if I had to maybe like look at the domestic system itself, I think and Karunya and Snehal have covered this in their report, that a lot of the talent is coming from smaller cities. And while the academies and all the big facilities are available in the city centers, smaller towns, while the academies are in the main cities, I think I've seen it in Hyderabad as well, where the more talented, or I suppose not more talented, but the ones with more fire or more fight, if you can call it that, come from the districts, and there's this real desire to succeed, and they really, really push themselves. So I don't know if I can name anyone, because I've got a ton of names swarming around in my head right now, having played against a lot of really talented young kids. So yeah, I'm just going to say Radha Yadav for now, because she's the first that pops into my head, and also she is in that team currently. So yeah.
I think you played that very well, ultimately.
So I think we've talked, about various aspects about women cricket, and also just, the problems faced. But now we want to talk a little bit about you both. So Karunya, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about the Equal Hue project. What are the goals? And I guess, as average cricket fans who just follow the sport and try to tune in as much as possible, what can we do to contribute?
So the Equal Hue project is a relatively long-term idea. So we're thinking about something, that we can achieve over 10 years. It is a collaboration between Snehal Pradhan, who is a cricket writer, commentator, former India player, and the Sports Law and Policy Center in Bangalore, and myself. So it started as a survey of 350 Indian cricketers who are like playing currently, which was the basis for a report on the state of women's cricket in India and what needs to be done. I don't think we get to hear a lot of the players very often. So this was just like one small step in attempting that. So what we are trying to do is basically offer suggestions on how we can improve excellence in Indian women's cricket, as well as, how do you set up these players for empowerment both during their playing careers and after it as well. So we're looking at at reaching all stakeholders, from fans to media, to corporates, maybe have a few more corporate tournaments, as Ananya mentioned a little earlier, uh, you know get into the conversation about school cricket, and obviously reach out to the BCCI as well at some point. So as of now, we're still aiming to get a lot of resources together, prepare a charter, and then see what we can deliver over the next 10 years. Now, what the average fan can do, for a start, they can talk about it, talk about women's sport, talk about cricket a little more. They can spread the message that this is not something special that you're granting women by, watching sport. It's the right thing to do. The Indian women's cricket team shouldn't have to wait a year to play. And if they are, more people need to be saying that, this is just not the right thing to do. We really need to normalize talking men's cricket and women's cricket together, looking at it with the same lens. It's really not okay to have a test match anymore and not have any female commentators there. And when they get on, it's not okay to troll them. So I think these are a lot of these little things that the average fan can do. If people want to be involved and want to hear more, they can just go onto our website, which is equalhue.in. That is UALHUE.in. And hopefully we'll keep them posted.
And your comment around the commentators part, that also reminds me of, I was recently listening to the Sky Sports podcast where they were talking about the women's game there. And obviously there was a recent incident with the English team where one of the players got trolled quite a bit. So they talked about sort of the outlook towards the game and all of that. And also about how, like, even the players, younger players coming in, always see men's coaches, always see men's umpires, scorers, and all these positions. So is it also thinking about that, or is it more specifically focused on the players for now?
No, it's about the whole ecosystem. So also about the media. How many people, how many women in top positions do you have? How many female reporters do you have? How many of them have access to basic knowledge about basic safety issues, all of it. So basically, women in cricket, not just the players. Obviously, the focus should be on the players because there's so many of them, and but also around it, the coaches, the education, what is, financial literacy, health, just telling a player who's 16 when that she's starting cricket, what sort of effects it could potentially have on her even 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Those are things that aren't available, and those are conversations that need to be had. If you need women in those positions to have those conversations, then they need to be women in all these positions to be able to facilitate these conversations.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So switching to Ananya, we want to know more about Women's Crick Zone. I noticed there's a magazine, there's an app as well. So how did this project start, and what are your goals with that, and how did you get into this role?
Well, I think it was, me getting on was chance, but how Women's Crick Zone started was, I think it started off as just it was I think it was Twitter handle, and they started tweeting scores and things like that during the 2017 World Cup. So Mr. Yash Lahoti, who is the co-founder, started tweeting scores and getting people interested in women's cricket. And apparently one of his friends asked him, why don't you start a website? So he then got in touch with Siddhanta Patnaik, who I worked with at Wisden India, who, kind of helped him set up the website, helped him with content, things like that. They started talking about how they could potentially help the women's game. And then Siddhanta fell sick. And that was during the time where he had thrown an idea to Yash about potentially starting a magazine. And I guess he suggested my name. So Yash got in touch with me. And, it's funny because the first magazine, we had 27 days to commission stories, to get them in, edit them, do the layout and print it and kind of launch it. Because so this was done during the Women's T20 Challenge in 2019. So the launch was supposed to be the day before the final. And so we had to make sure that everything got done before that. And I was in the US, so I was traveling to my sister. So I was working at crazy hours, literally getting up at 1 a.m. and kind of trying to make sure that I edited everything, and basically working sleepless nights. But luckily everything came together. So May 10th, I think we released the first issue of the magazine. And after that, Yash asked me if I would kind of come on board for the website as well. I think I kind of said yes because I felt like I wanted to help. I've always wanted to do something for the women's game ever since I first started watching women's cricket. One of my things was either I wanted to play for the country or I wanted to make sure that people knew about women's cricket, whether that was by writing about it or something else. So I thought this was my chance to kind of get involved. And yeah, I've been involved ever since. We have the magazine is kind of a bi-yearly thing. We do it twice a year. There really no time. There's no time frame for it because we do it whenever we can. We kind of jump on if there's an event, maybe just before the World Cup, release the magazine. If there's something else with it, so that's how we've been doing it now. We hope to regularize it a little better. And yeah, the magazine's actually being released on International Women's Day, March 8th. So hey, people, download it, please. Karan has written an excellent piece. So yeah, that's how I got involved. And we basically what we want to do is, again, create conversation around the women's game, and I think give it the coverage that it deserves, because you see, while mainstream websites are trying to give the women's game coverage, they still do focus a lot more on the men's game because that's where the money is. So we're just trying to do what we can, tell the stories of not just players in countries like India and Australia, but also around the world, whether that's Germany, Scotland. I think a lot of these players have some really amazing stories. So yeah, just to help people get to know not just the players, but the people who work in women's cricket. So women in cricket, yeah, it's just starting, and hopefully we're able to grow in the years to come.
That sounds like a great project. And for all our listeners, March 8th, keep an eye on the magazine. All right. We really appreciate both of your times. And this has been a really enlightening conversation for, I'm sure Himanish will agree, for both of us, because we've obviously tried to follow the game, and in the recent years when a lot of it has been on TV, it's obviously been a little easier. But there are still so many aspects which we're still trying to learn and understand. So both the book, The Fire Burns Blue, as well as this conversation, really helps us. So we appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having.
Thanks for having us.
Well, that's it for this episode of The Last Wicket. A special thank you to our guests Karunya and Ananya. Please do follow these lovely ladies on Twitter at KUKS and at @A_Upendran11. Please do check out Karunya's book, The Fire Burns Blue, A History of Women's Cricket in India, and the Equal Hue Project, as well as Ananya's work at Women's Crick Zone. We have helpfully added all the links to these in our show notes. Meanwhile, do rate and subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes, follow us on your social media feeds, and do spread the word about this show. For more details, please visit our website at thelastwicket.com. Once again, thank you for listening, and we hope you come back for more. From all of us here at The Last Wicket, have a great week.